Hello and welcome back to another Chapter 5 video. This video, we're going to go through our exercises that are in your study guides. Now, the idea behind this is that hopefully you've attempted this on your own, just kind of working with the problems, working with the material, um, actively working with it, and maybe making mistakes, and that's okay. The idea behind these videos are to provide you with that correct answer and kind of provide you with some instant feedback in the sense of you either have already worked on those exercises or you're going to pause the video, work on the exercises, and then check your answer. So the first one we have deals with the effect of changes in activity on net operating income. And this is exercise 5-1 that coincides with your study guide. So they give us a bunch of numbers, right? They give us sales, variable expenses, contribution margin, fixed expenses, net operating income. And they also give us the per unit selling price, the per unit variable cost, and the contribution margin at 10,000 units. Okay, so what we want to do is just answer 1, 2, and 3. And we have to consider each of these independently. So the first one says, what would be the revised net operating income per month if sales volume increased by 100 units? Okay, so if you remember, there's two ways we can do this. We can do this the quick and dirty way, or we can do it the longer way. I'm going to show you both ways. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, well, what are my sales? Well, I know that my sales have to be 35. Actually, let me bump down here. The per unit price for sales and variable costs do not change, right? The only thing that change is the sales volume. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of create my very abbreviated contribution formatted income statement. Okay, and I'm going to put my totals here, and I'm going to put my per unit costs and prices right here. So the first one is $35. That's my per unit cost, right? That does not change in this scenario. My variable cost per unit is $20 per unit. How do I calculate my contribution margin? Very simple. I subtract. I take my sales per unit minus the variable cost per unit, which is sales C3, and I get $15. Okay? So what they're telling us is that sales go up by 100 units. So to figure out what my total sales are going to be, I take my $35 per unit times $10,100, or I'm sorry, 10,100 units. I get a sales volume or total sales of $353,500. I do the same thing with variable cost, right? I take my variable cost per unit, which is $20, times my new sales figure, 10,100 units. I get $202,000 of variable cost. To figure out my contribution margin, very easy. I take my total sales, subtract out my total variable cost, and I get 151. That's not right. Why is that not right? Yeah, it is. I'm sorry. $151,500. So now I need to subtract out my fixed expenses. Well, fixed expenses didn't change. They're still $135,000. So what is my new net operating income? CM minus fixed costs, which is cell reference B5 here. I get $16,500. Now, I could have gotten the same thing by looking at the contribution margin, right? I could do the change. So this is number one. Here's a second way I could have done it. I could have said, what's my original NOI? Well, I know my original net NOI was $15,000. Okay. What then is the change in the contribution margin? Well, that's easy. I'm selling 100 more units. My contribution margin is $15. I get $1,500 increase in contribution margin. I can then add these, and I get 16.5. That's the same number, and this is the new NOI. Okay? So again, we can do it either way. This shortcut way really exemplifies the definition of the contribution margin that says once we're past that break-even point, which we know we are because we look at the original information, we're selling 10,000 units, our net operating income is $15,000. We're well above the break-even point. Okay? We know that the contribution margin increases the bottom line. So contribution margin increases our net operating income with an increase in sales volume. So not too bad there. Now let's look at number two. Okay? Number two says, what would be the revised net operating income per month if sales volume decreased by 100 units? Okay? I can do this the same exact way, right? I can do it the long way. I'm just going to copy and paste my abbreviated contribution formatted income statement, right? My per unit cost did not change, so I'm just going to copy and paste these down here. There we go. Now it's lined up. Okay. So I can go ahead and just calculate it out. Well, sales dropped by 100 units. I had 10,000, so I have to have 900 or 9,900 units being sold times my selling price. My new sales are 346,500. I do the same thing with variable costs, right? 9,900 units times my per unit variable cost of $20. Okay? Now check this out. Contribution margin. I could subtract if I wanted to, or I could say, 9,900 times my $15 contribution margin per unit gives me $148,500. I then subtract out my fixed costs, which are still $135,000. I see that my net income dropped, and my new net income is $13,500. Okay? What is my new net operating income? Well, it's $13,500. I can do the same quick and easy calculation if sales decrease, right? So I know that my original net operating income was $15,000. I can now calculate the change in contribution margin while I'm selling 100 units less. So very simply, I can take negative 100 units, multiply it by my contribution margin per unit, $15, I get a negative $1,500. So my contribution margin decreases by $1,500. Well, guess what? Because of the definition of the contribution margin, any change in NOI has a direct impact on that bottom line. Again, as long as I'm above the break-even point, which we are, my net operating income is the same, right? Now let's look at number 3. Number 3 says, okay, what's the revised net operating income if my sales are $9,000 or 9,000 units, excuse me. So that's easy, right? I'm going to scroll down here a little bit and I'm going to just copy and paste my original contribution formatted income statement. My per unit cost did not change. Okay, so my sales are still $35 per unit. My variable cost is still $20 per unit. My contribution margin is still $15 per unit. So I'm just going to calculate the new sales. 9,000 times my per unit selling price, $315. My new variable cost in total, 9,000 times that $20, 180. Okay, well, what's my contribution margin now? Well, sales minus my total variable costs, which is B15, $135. Okay. I now subtract my fixed expenses. Well, what are my fixed expenses? $135, or $135,000 rather. What is my new net operating income? It's 0. Okay, so I have in fact hit the break-even point. 9,000 units is my break-even point in this example. So that is how you do exercise 5-1 in your study guide. Please set it up identical to how it's set up here. The reason why is because as we go through and we start working with changes in sales volume, changes in variable costs, fixed costs, whatever, we have to use this contribution formatted income statement. So please do this. Please go ahead and show your work. And don't just, jot down a number. That really doesn't help us out, right? We got to work through these calculations. So let's look at the second exercise that we have to do. And the exercise is 5-4. Computing and using the CM ratio. Okay, no problem. We can do this. Jaffrey Enterprise distribute. Oh, nope, wrong one. Sorry. Last month, when Holiday Creations Incorporated sold 50,000 units, total sales were $200,000. Total variable expenses were $120,000, and fixed expenses were $65,000. The first thing we need to do is we need to determine what is the CM ratio of the company. We can do that very, very easily, right? First thing we need to do is we need to calculate what's our contribution margin ratio. We can do that very easily. Sales less variable costs. Well, they tell us our sales was $200,000. $200,000. They tell us the variable expenses, or the total variable expenses or variable costs, were $120,000. Okay, so to get the CM, all we do is subtract variable cost minus expenses. Oh, sorry. We have $80,000. That is our contribution margin. Now, they want us to figure out what is the CM ratio, right? So we have our sales, which is we have our total contribution margin, which is A. We have our total sales, which we know is B. So to figure out the CM ratio, I'm going to take A divided by B. I'm going to take 80,000 and I'm going to divide it by my sales, which is 200,000. Okay? So what is my CM ratio then? Well, very easy. 80 divided by 200,000 gives me 40%. Okay? Number 2 says, what is the estimated change in the company's net operating income if it can increase total sales by $1,000? Okay, now remember, think back to the video. We have a change in net operating income from an increase in total sales of $1,000. We can estimate this by using that CM ratio, right? So for number 2, we have an increase of $1,000. What's the change? You don't need to write this in your study guide. What's the change in NOI? Well, that's very easy. We can use the CM ratio, right? What do? Well, very easily. We take the change in total sales, which ends up being $1,000, right? They told us. We then multiply that by the CM ratio, which we know is 40%. So to figure out what the estimated change is in that net operating income, we just multiply. And we get $400. That's how we solve the second exercise. Very simple, very easy, just utilizing the sales and the contribution margin. Now, we could have done this the long way, right? We could have calculated everything out, did the contribution formatted income statement. Way too long, right? No need to do that. So that's the first 2 exercises that we have to do. The next exercise is 5-5, which looks at changes in variable costs, fixed costs, selling price, and volume. Okay, this one's going to be a little bit longer. So what I want to do is I want to come back in a second video and kind of go over that one step by step and show you how to do it. Okay. Again, these are calculations that we're making. I know they might seem a little trivial, but these are things that we use in the real world, right? If you want to figure out, hey, here's my sales volume, here are my budgeted numbers, what happens if I change something? How's that going to have an impact on my bottom line? Well, let's do the calculations and let's figure it out. Okay? So please tune back in for our next video where we go over exercise 5-5 of your study guides.